Right, we are live and we are good to start, Stephen.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Yep, it sounds good. My name's Stephen Howes. I'm the Director of the Development Policy Centre, and along with the Asia Foundation, I host for tonight's seminar, at least tonight if you're here in cold Canberra, but wherever you're joining us from, welcome. This is part of a series that we're running from our Australasian Aid Conference, where we've invited back some of our sort of most popular speakers to give them another go and to ask them to share with us some of their new thinking. Before we go any further, let us acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, wherever you are. And in the case of Canberra, for me, it's the Ngunnawal people. And so I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I think Lant Pritchett really needs no introduction. And if I gave him a proper introduction, I'd take up the entire time that we've got for tonight's presentation. So I'll just be brief. But I think this is about the sixth in our series, and it's actually the final series, as we'll tell you a bit more at the end. We are bringing back Australasian Aid Conference at the end of the year. So this has been a great series, but it is coming to an end. And I think we have, you could safely say we've left the best for last. So I'm sure Lant is known to many of you. He had a he's had a prolific career, full stop. He had a long career with the World Bank, working both in the research department and on some of the World Bank's sort of biggest client countries, India and Indonesia. And he's then been around the place. It's hard to keep up with you, Lant, but I know you've been at Centre for Global Development and Harvard, and you're now based in London. But I think the best way to introduce Lant is, or to give you a sense of him, is to say he was a keynote speaker at our last conference, the last one we held before the pandemic, early 2020, where he delivered a keynote address. I'm just going to read it. The title was "Good Intentions, Great Policies, Crappy Outcomes: The Difficult Dynamics of Deals." So very much a Lant Pritchett heading. But whereas most keynote speakers would come and give their keynote speech and then perhaps hang around or head off, Lant participated fully in the conference, and I remember took part in a debate with Andrew Lee on the importance of randomized control trials. I think that was the highlight of the conference. Took part in a panel on education, and I think there was another event as well that Lant took part in. I mentioned that because it sort of characterizes, Lant has written on and been influential in such a wide range of areas, from economic growth through to education, through to methodological questions, through to foreign aid. And in all of these areas, he's well known and provocative, but he's provocative, not based on just on snappy titles, but on real research, on path-breaking research, and on making us see the world in new ways. So I'm sure tonight's talk will be no exception, and we'll learn a lot about economic growth, perhaps some of what we've forgotten from the past. In terms of the proceedings for tonight, I've introduced Lant, so I'm going to finish. After Lant's talk, we're open for Q&A. So please do submit your questions. You can do that through the chat function. Send in a written comment or question, or if you want to raise your hand, we'll come to you at the end. And my colleague Peter Yates, Peter's with the Asia Foundation, and as I said, it's just as we co-host the Aid Conference, we're co-hosting the speaker series. So thanks, Peter, for helping out with that. And then finally, we'll hand over to Beth Orton, who's also from the Development Policy Centre as our centre manager, and Beth will bring the events to a close. So I think that's all from me. And please now join with me in giving a virtual round of applause to Dr. Lant Pritchett. Thank you, Lant. Over to you. Hey, you're on mute.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I rarely turn down an invitation to come to Australia, and have enjoyed being at the conferences held there many times. So I'm happy to be invited back virtually, and with optimism, we'll come again together in person soon. Today, I want to talk about economic growth. And I worry a lot that within the context of development and development agencies and the discussions of the development endeavor, that growth is now radically underemphasized as the means by which all of the targets and goals of development and improving human well-being will be improved. There seems to be a pushback that with titles that are now common, like growth is not enough. And there's a sort of a lot of debate about the adjectives that should go before growth. Should we have sustainable inclusive growth, or should we have inclusive sustainable growth, or should we have poor pro growth, or should we have sustainable and so a variety of things. And the one way I'm going to make my point is that a purple unicorn and a polka dot unicorn are exactly ontologically the same, and neither can pull your cart. So before one worries about the adjectives, you actually have to worry about the noun. And unless and until there is sustained, not sustainable, and rapid economic growth, my argument is the rest of the adjectives around it are relatively pointless. So if you have an inclusive non-growth is not very much the same thing as non-inclusive growth. Non-inclusive growth is in fact radically better for you than inclusive non-growth. And so the whole focus on what type and the sequence of growth, I think, has led people both away from growth as an overall phenomena and to focus on relatively minor points about it. So, and I'm going to start with just 4 figures that I think should be kind of very strongly in everyone's head as one engages in debates about the relative importance of growth as one of the key instrumental objectives. Everything I'm going to say is nothing that I'm going to say says that growth is an objective in and of itself, but I am saying very strongly that growth is an instrumentally important objective to achieving every other goal. So, and I'm just going to give 5 figures that I hope are kind of summarize kind of key empirical facts that should be in your head and should inform the debate. The first of these is, I think everybody who works in development should have some clear idea of the hockey stick graph. The hockey stick graph is this graph of historical GDP per capita of the leading economies in the world going back into distant time. And as if you take this graph back to as far back as one can create any notion of GDP, it's roughly flat from the dawn of history till sometime around the mid-19th century. So if you look at what GDP per capita, the estimates of what it was in the few countries for which you can create it in 1 BC, when Caesar Augustus ruled the world, from Caesar Augustus to the mid-19th century, it changed by roughly a factor of 3. So in 2,000 years, there was some modest progress, and this is of the leading countries, but very modest. Its actual growth rate was minuscule. And then sometime around the mid-19th century, something happened. The leading countries accelerated into sustained, exponential growth. And the orange line is the hockey stick. It's a very sharp curve that has taken off and has sustained growth for a very long time. And so GDP in the leading countries, went from only roughly $4,000 in 1850 to $8,000 by 1950 to $40,000 by 2000 to of the 3 leading countries in the world are now over $60,000 in 2018. That is Now, within that grounding, at the right-hand side of this graph is the box plot of where the current developing countries are. And roughly the median developing country today is roughly where the leading countries of the world was 120 years ago. So India and Vietnam, who were sort of median income of the distribution of developing country GDP, are at levels of GDP that the United States, Great Britain, and New Zealand, who were the leading countries in 1900, already enjoyed in 1900. So, and are extremely far in an absolute sense from where the leading countries are today. People talk about convergence and divergence, and is convergence happening or not happening? One has to keep in mind that all of what has basically happened since the mid-18th century is a massive divergence from which some countries are making up that gap relatively quickly, like China has climbed from being very low to very high. And then the last part of this is the very poor countries in the world are still at, if you look at the bottom 25th percentile, the bottom 25th percentile of countries, which is still 20 or 30 countries in the world, are at levels of GDP that were last experienced in the leading countries in the world, even before the growth acceleration of 1850. So, Bangladesh is roughly where, Bangladesh is roughly where the leading countries in the world were at the very beginnings of the takeoff of the Industrial Revolution. So the main point of this is that we can imagine that if we're going to have a debate about the importance of growth, we have to radically separate out that debate in Australia for Australia, that debate in New Zealand for New Zealand, that debate in Germany for Germany, from the question of if Australia or New Zealand or Germany cared about the well-being of other countries. So New Zealand can easily choose to say, at our very, very high levels of GDP per capita, it's no longer a priority to us. But to extrapolate that back into the levels of GDP in the developing countries is just not on, because they're so very far from where New Zealand or Australia is today. And, if you think about it, no one is people might be talking about a modest de-emphasis of growth as an objective of the developing countries at levels of 40,000. But nobody in those countries is talking about reversing any of that growth. And nobody in those countries would have been saying we should not worry about economic growth in 1900 or in 1850 or at the times at which they had developing country growth. So the first basic graph that everyone should have in their mind is what happened to the hockey stick and where the current countries are now. And they are at levels of GDP that were last experienced in the rich countries, not in my memory, not in my father's memory, not in my grandfather's memory. They are generations and generations. The level of GDP is what was experienced in the now prosperous countries generations and generations ago. So that's the first graph. Second graph is, suppose you say, well, we don't really care about growth. Growth is all instrumental to other objectives, and these objectives for achieving these objectives, growth is neither necessary or sufficient. So growth is not enough, suggests that growth isn't sufficient. And sort of people can doubt whether growth is necessary. But let's start with the first of three graphs like this. The first graph just shows on the left-hand side, you see the relationship between the three levels of poverty lines commonly used by the World Bank: extreme poverty at $1.90, poverty at $3.20, and sort of a global poverty line at $5.50. And the scatter plot is just showing the nonlinear relationship between the level of poverty in a country and the median income or consumption of the distribution from which that poverty is calculated. And the essence of this graph is there isn't some relationship between those two things, or even a strong relationship between those two things. Those things are in fact nearly identical, such that It's just, you know, the growth of the income of the typical individual is strongly necessary and strongly sufficient, in the sense that the white space actually means something. There are no countries that achieve high levels of median income for which poverty doesn't go to essentially zero. And there are no countries with low median income for which poverty reaches low levels. So if you know, the blue dots are my preferred dots because that's a sort of moderate thing. Basically, at low levels of per capita consumption, low levels of median consumption, the consumption individual, just poverty rates are necessarily, necessarily because the poverty line is below the median, poverty rates are necessarily very high. And yes, there's some variation, you know, at very low levels of income, some countries might have 85% poor and some might have near 100% poor, but it's within that range. And then it declines very rapidly and then tapers off to near zero. The graph is, by the way, truncated. And the same thing on the right-hand side is true of long episodes. Once we generate long episodes of comparable data between consumption, again, the reason poverty rates fall is because the median, the income of the typical individual in the country goes up. And over and above that, there's just almost nothing. You know, if you look at the left-hand side graph, the R squared of these things is 0.988. It means if you ask me the question, why is the poverty rate of this country what it is? The answer to in approximate sense is, it is that because the median of the distribution in that country is this. And if you don't, and once you understand what the median of the country is, there's almost nothing else left to really, there is some variation, but it's super tiny relative to the total variation across countries. So essentially all of the variation in poverty rates, both across countries and over time, is due to overall, the overall consumption or income of the typical individual of the country. And there's nothing about the poor that is really relevant to the poverty rate. So strangely enough, the poverty rate has nothing to do with the poor. The poverty rate is determined by the productivity of the typical individual. So growth is strongly necessary and strongly sufficient for the reduction of the standard, any of the standard measures of headcount poverty. So that's the second graph, which again, we started with just the evolution of GDP and where it stands, and then we see that the resulting of those massive differences in income and GDP per capita translate into massive differences in median consumption, translate into massive differences in poverty. So if you want to reduce poverty, you have to increase median income. The second is there is a lot of discussion among people who do development that we economists are sort of over fascinated with per capita consumption as a metric of well-being of people, and that there are lots of things about the well-being of people that matter beyond income. Perfectly open to that. And so one thing, so what I did empirically in each of these graphs I'm showing you comes from a different piece of research that I've done that I've combined together. I started from an index created by something called the Social Progress Initiative. And what the Social Progress Initiative is, they created a social product index that was completely, totally free of any economic measure. So they didn't have income, they didn't have consumption, they didn't have poverty rates, they didn't have any money metric indicators. They had only physical indicators about things they felt were important to overall well-being, which was a broad array of indicators, including health indicators of various types, education indicators of various types, infrastructure access of various types, crime, inequality, tolerance, freedom, a broad array that they felt was a better way of representing the progress in development than the money metric indicators that economists love so much. Well, the question was, okay, now that you, the have created the Social Progress Index, how much of the variation across countries in that is also basically just, again, as an association associated with our standard measures of what we development economists would have focused on, which I take as a fourfold transformational process of countries, what I call national development, which is a transformation to a more productive economy, a transformation to a more capable state, a transformation to a more democratic and responsive government, and a transformation towards more equal treatment and rule of law. And with just 3 of those indicators, GDP per capita, state capability, and a measure of democracy, I ask how much of the variation across countries in a social progress index that has no economic indicators and nothing about national development, how much of that is associated with a national development index, which is just the sort of regression weighted index of the 3 factors of national development. And it turns out, again, just super strongly correlated. Basically, you see every country with a low national development index has low social progress index, and every country with a high national development index has a high level of social progress index. And the graph that I've constructed, which I'd never seen before, but I built it because I thought it was interesting. The graph that you're seeing is an envelope. The lower bar is, this is the lowest your social progress can be for any country with your national development or higher, or for your, and the upper bar is the highest it can be for any country with your level of national development or lower. So it's the range of observed for any given level of national development, it's the range of observed social progress. And what we see is there is variation across countries. Some countries with the same level of national development appear to have higher or lower, but that range is quite small relative to the total range of countries. And so, if again, the white space here means something. There is no one in the Northwest. No country has high levels of social progress at very low levels of national development. It just doesn't happen. So some countries are higher and some countries are lower. And there's, again, you would rather be higher for a given level of national development lower, but it's just a complete total myth that countries achieve high levels of any metric, any aggregate measure of human well-being without having achieved high levels of national development. So you can say, and then with this, you can say, geez, suppose I wanted to achieve Argentina's level of social progress as kind of a high-end developing country. What is the level of national development at which, what country what's the lowest national development that anybody gets there? And it's, somewhat lower than Argentina's, but it's still pretty high, and vice versa. So it's also sufficient. There's nobody in the Southeast. No country actually experiences national development and doesn't also achieve the massive progress in these completely non-money metric indicators of human development. So there is a range, but we shouldn't get confused that this is lack of correlation or that it's easy to be up in the Northwest. And if we just had better programs and better allocation of government resources or more knowledge or more cost effectiveness, we could, easily move large distances north while still maintaining the same levels of GDP, state capability, and democracy. At those levels, again, there's range, but there are also quite sharp limits to the range. And secondly, nobody moves east and doesn't go north. It's just a very strong, powerful tendency. So that's the third graph that it's like, let's, forget all about any money metric progress and just say, does national development reliably and strongly associated with aggregate omnibus indicators of human well-being that we would like to see improved? And the answer is just powerfully yes. And it is both empirically necessary and sufficient. To get to high levels of social progress, you need to get to high levels of national development. And conversely, if you get to high levels of national development, you will get to higher and high levels of social progress. By the way, just since I wrote this paper, which was just came out in 2022, but was written last year, I've written another paper with completely different omnibus indicator and reproduces roughly exactly the same results. So given the way you produce these aggregate omnibus indicators of human well-being, it kind of doesn't matter what you throw in there, you're going to get roughly the same looking thing. So we can come back to that in Q&A, but these results are quite robust. This isn't a feature of the Social Progress Index, it's a feature of the world. So the second, and this is the fourth graph, it's also, I wanted to do the same thing as this omnibus aggregate indicator of human well-being, but with things that are just basics, because you know the Social Progress Index includes all kinds of things that are of interest that are both basic and more sophisticated, like tolerance of alternative lifestyles and other things that we would expect in very prosperous societies, but may not be super basic, like child mortality and primary education. So again, just recently, a paper that I just finished 2 weeks ago, I tried to say, well, how would I decide what's a basic? And then in order to study the relationship between basics and not even broad-based national development, but just the relationship between basics and just GDP per capita. So I developed a whole variety of ways of which one would say, let's take from the available pot of and collection of well-being indicators and define which ones are basic, then construct an index of the basics and then look at the relationship with that of GDP per capita. And the finding is, no matter how you do it, any index of basics that's general, includes multiple dimensions, and has reasonable weights, will produce exactly this same relationship that I'm showing you, which is that the relationship between basics and GDP per capita is quite strong and enormously nonlinear. So the progress towards basics is very steep at low levels of income and then tapers off. And it tapers off such that it's roughly flat for the top quartile of countries in the world. So at roughly 40,000 per capita GDP, around that range, the sort of relationship goes flat. And if a country said, we're above 40,000 in GDP, we're not going to really worry about increasing GDP as instrumental to achieving basics, they would be roughly empirically correct that the relationship between GDP per capita and achieving the basics is roughly flat beyond that point. But below that point, and roughly the range over which, in which most of the developing countries are, the relationship between GDP per capita and basics is just enormously strong. So the first quartile of countries, the 20th percentile is 3,500 in GDP per capita. And at that level, you can see the relationship's almost vertical. And then it sort of tapers off to at 25,000, it's starting to get less steep. And then about 40,000, it's steep. So, and again, this is just emphasizing that if we're having a sort of discussion about how big a priority should economic growth be, we should be having a radically different discussion in Australia versus what Australia might be concerned about in the extent it has altruistic concern for other countries. So Australia is almost certainly up in the range in which, look, for both aggregate well-being and for basics, Australia has reached levels at which further increases in GDP per capita won't matter. And so one can have a debate about the relative priority of further growth because it's, you know, at the margin, unlikely to improve like hugely important increases in well-being in and of itself. But at lower levels of income, you just can't assume that the relationship would be anything like the same between Australia and countries at sort of the bulk of the developing countries. if you look at the graph, remember the median income is about 6,000. So 6,000 cuts right on, in some sense, the very steepest part of this relationship. So for the bulk of countries we regard as developing countries, they are still very much in the steep part of the relationship. So now I want to go to the fifth figure. And the fifth figure has many variants because it tries to pack a lot into the thing. The fifth figure gets to the concern, I think, that many have that, well, economic growth really isn't important because the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and sort of the bias of the growth process towards the rich means that growth really doesn't bring broad-based benefits. So what I'm showing on this graph is on the horizontal axis is the initial income or consumption of each of the deciles. So this is the distribution of income, and it shows that the rich are richer and that there is an additional distribution. And then on the vertical axis, I show what is a growth incidence curve, which is what was the percentage rate of growth of each decile. So this is showing simultaneously the location of the deciles, how poor was the poorest decile relative to the richest decile, and how rich or poor were they relative to people in other places and countries. And at the same time, I'm showing you whether the growth process was inclusive or exclusive, or inequality increasing or not equality increasing. And in this graph, an absolutely flat growth incidence curve would be an equal proportionate rate of growth of all the deciles, which would leave the inequality unchanged. A downward sloping curve, as we see for Chile, for instance, or Brazil, sorry, as we see for Brazil, Brazil had much more rapid growth of the poorer deciles than the richer deciles, and so inequality fell. Zambia, which is the bottom green triangles, had a disequalizing and negative growth. So the very richest grew much faster than the very poorest because their incomes were constant and the incomes of everybody poorer fell. So let me, with this graph, make sort of 4 quick sort of variants on this same graph. The first, and all of these are again related to debates of how we would think about the importance of growth process for developing countries. And many times people sort of, again, dismiss the importance of growth because they think it's the inclusiveness of growth that is essential, in part because I think they have mistaken ideas. One is they think the rich of poor countries are richer than they really are. Second, they think the normative valuation of income falls faster than it really does. Third, they think the variation in inclusivity versus inclusivity is much larger than it really is relative to the variation in growth. And fourth, they think the gains have been concentrated at the top much more than they really are. So the first thing is, the first thing about this graph is the rich of the poor are enormously poorer than the poor of the rich. And especially at the start of this period. So in this graph, Vietnam, the mean income of the top decile in Vietnam was $2,500 in PPP terms at the beginning of the period. And Denmark and the US, in Denmark, the income of the first decile, the poorest 10% of people in Denmark, was 5,700. So by and large, the rich of the poor are much poorer than the poor of the rich. So again, if you're dismissing growth because it benefits the rich, well, the rich are actually pretty poor people. They're poor. The people that would be considered the poorest people in Australia are by and large substantially richer than the people in the top tiers of top percentiles. There are obviously huge tail events, and we'll get back to that. But the rich of the poor are not rich people. The rich of the poor are poor people by global or rich country standards. The second, and this is a hugely, unbelievably, stupidly complex graph, but the second thing is, and what I want you to take away from this graph is that poverty lines are stupid. And I guess I put it more politely here, completely nuts. Because the essence of a poverty line is that you say, if poverty is my objective, then there's kind of a responsiveness of your objective with respect to incremental growth. And with a poverty line, it goes to zero. What you're saying is, if I'm concerned about poverty, then growth of incomes above poverty doesn't have any impact on poverty, and therefore is kind of zero valuation in my objective function. And I think this has been a massive, cumulatively massive mistake and path that development has gone down, because it's just wildly crazy that in fact anything like the marginal valuation of income is zero anywhere near any of the poverty lines. So just as a simple way of putting that, if you look at the food consumption, so there's a green dotted graph going through here called the Ingle predicted food share. And you just ask when a person stops being poor, what's the incremental spending of their budget on food? And even at the high World Bank poverty line, people are spending 50% of their budget on food. How can you imagine that the incremental marginal utility, marginal valuation of income gains is zero when half of the budget is being devoted to food? And for other indicators, child mortality or improvement in the basics, it's even worse. It's that the elasticity of these things with respect to income goes up with respect to income for a quite broad range. And so essentially countries in the developing world are at the peak, at the range in which they're now in, they're at the peak of responsiveness of improvement in basics with respect to growth. So the idea that growth has little value because it's being wasted or not spent on necessities or something is just, it's an artifact of having created completely wildly stupid poverty lines that I wish they had never been born. Okay.
And I'm just conscious of the time. I want to leave some time for Q&A.
Yeah.
So five minutes.
So I'm going to do two more graphs. One is, the third thing is, if you look at a graph and say, how much of the variation in what happened to you if you were poor depended on what happened to the rich in your country versus how much was the overall level of the growth incidence curve. The level of the growth incidence curve dominates the shape of the incidence curve by an order of magnitude. So this gets back to the purple unicorn versus brown horse. Look, in Vietnam, the poorest group grew much slower than the middle income group, but they still grew 5 times faster than the poor in Bangladesh. So if you're just worried about the absolute improvement, you would enormously rather live in a country with non-inclusive growth than in a country with inclusive non-growth. It's just orders of magnitude bigger and more important, the country you're in and the overall level of the growth incidence curve. So if you don't have growth, whether that lack of growth is inclusive or uninclusive just doesn't matter for well-being improvement. And secondly, the shape of the curve just doesn't matter that much for well-being improvement, because pretty much everybody in these economies is in a range in which income gains are leading to really important improvements in human well-being. The fourth thing is, you might think all of this is somehow influenced by excluding the richest of the rich, and a lot of the gains have gone to the richest. But again, I'll just say, no, that's not true. This is my final slide. It's just, look, most of the arguments against economic development being strongly and almost exclusively focused on overall national development processes, which are inclusive of growth, state capability, and a more responsive government, all those arguments are mostly wrong. And so the current trend towards a micro focus on the efficacy of the individual programs, it's biasing the field away from everything that's important. I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Lant. Thank you. Not at all surprising, but super interesting, super stimulating, and challenging, and of course very well argued as well. Please do, participants, put questions in the Q&A or stick your hands up. And while you're doing that, I might take moderator's prerogative and ask you a first question, Lant, just to see how sharp your argument is here. So if we were to take your argument based on the 5 graphs you've just presented, I think what you're saying is that not only is economic growth a key objective of development, but it should be the key objective of development. And so if you woke up tomorrow and rode your purple polka dot unicorn to your new job as head of USAID or head of SCDO in London, what are you immediately getting rid of? What are you doing away with because of the opportunity cost of missing out on reprioritizing economic growth when it comes to a donor agency?
I'm getting away with the 90% of the research and thought that goes into the individual program design versus the overall. I'm getting away with everything that asks, does this project work to deliver conditional on national development? And I'm refocusing every single project, everything we do to say, is this project, is this activity, is this research, is this analysis leading to a better dynamic of national development? So for instance, so a lot of development projects are enormously state capability using, but not really focused on, are they state capability building? So even if I'm doing a water project or a gender empowerment project or a environmental sustainability project, I want to be simultaneously considering, is it achieving the narrow objectives of the project? But more importantly, is this part of an overall strategy for national development? And if I can't make the case that it's an overall strategy of national development, I'm asking why. I'm asking, am I simultaneously building national development with this? Am I simultaneously accelerating productivity with this? And if not, can't we find something that works better than that? So for instance, just Nature magazine, which is the most prominent scientific journal in the world, just published a paper by a group of 10 researchers which focused on cash transfers in Niger. And then among the treatment arms of cash treatments in Niger, they did a cash transfer plus a psychosocial intervention. That I would eliminate the day I took charge, because that's both stupid and offensive and morally wrong to start treating poverty in Niger as if it's a result of the choices people in Niger make as opposed to the choices they have. And if I'm not focused on expanding and improving the choices people in Niger have, and I'm fiddling around with treatment arms about nudging them to make better choices, I have lost the big picture completely. But that's where development's gone, and that's where research has gone, and that's where I would get out of.
Fantastic. Again, a very clear argument there. I know we've got great development economists on the call. I know we've got great programming practitioners on the call, many of them implementing projects that probably you would do away with immediately. So let's see. We've got a question first from Bill Walker. What role do educational and health outcomes play in increasing economic growth?
So I don't know if you know, but I have a quite widely cited paper on that called "Where Is All the Education Gone?" And it depends. First is most of what we have been doing in the developing world is schooling, which is putting children through more and more years of schooling. And I think it's now a widely accepted fact that the expansion of schooling is roughly uncorrelated with economic growth. Everybody who's looked at it with a reasonably unbiased eye, in part because we've been so successful at expanding schooling. Schooling has expanded in a bunch of countries that have had no growth, and it's expanded a bunch in countries that have had growth. but the expansion in schooling has been so uniform, it basically can't explain any of the variation. Meaning, since if everybody does it, you can't say the successful people were successful because they did it and the unsuccessful weren't because they weren't, because everybody did it. So with schooling, for sure, it's almost zero correlation. There's a deeper point about whether some countries were more successful in getting more skills acquired and more education per years of schooling, and that they did better. And that has some empirical credence to it. So that said, that's very hard to parse out whether countries who did better at generating more education per year of schooling were also just generally more got it together, focused, and better run countries. And then health, I think the impact is meh. It's not that big a deal. And the reason it's not that big a deal is if you think of the mortality curve, what happened early in the development process is this is by age and this is mortality rate. The mortality rate is always kind of a U, meaning there was high child mortality, and then kind of in adult ages there was pretty low mortality, and then there was late age mortality, and nearly all of the improvement in life expectancy has come from driving down child mortality and driving down old age mortality, neither of which is that economically not, it's a huge and important objective for human well-being. I'm not disputing that we should radically focus on better health for human beings, but its economic consequences are mostly marginal.
Great. We've got 2 questions from Fiona Ryan. So it says, with adaptation to climate change or other disasters, should we focus on people most affected or the institutions of government in the place or the location? And then a second question, are effective markets essential for development?
So on the second question, unambiguously, yes. I mean, the way countries develop is they get more productive, and every country we've seen get radically more productive. The bulk of that is making markets more effective. So I think that is, the key to the hockey stick, the key to which countries are doing well, the key to everything could be broadly put as making markets more effective. Now, I want to be clear that when I say making markets more effective, that is not laissez-faire. That is making markets more effective. And you can do things that look like, that's not necessarily a completely unregulated market. It's an effective market, which involves rule of law and enforcement and contract enforcement and all kinds of engagement of the state in the process of making markets effective. But yes. On the first one, I think this is just a subset of my more general point. I think we have placed way too much attention on what government should do as opposed to what is the government capable of doing. And in field after field after field that I've worked in, people come in with wildly exaggerated expectations of what a focus on adaptability to climate change or a focus on this or that thing could produce, conditional on the overall just unbelievably low effectiveness of the state. So I would focus on, is the way I am doing what I'm doing, like adaptability to climate change, is it ultimately building the aggregate capability of the state to do more things? And if it's state capability reallocating or state capability draining, then you really should think twice about it. And you should really build into everything you do, is the state stronger when I'm finished than when I started, both generically and at doing what I need to do? Because again, I think this is the reason why there's just dozens and dozens of completely failed projects, is that we just assume a capability that doesn't exist. And then because we want the government to be able to do a specific thing, we either assume it's there, or we cocoon it from the rest of the government, or we create special project vehicles to do it. And that in the end just doesn't do anybody any long run good. I'm
Fantastic.
taking things out very brutally, I know, but I'm doing it because time is short, and I think I want to be as clear and as controversial as I can possibly be.
Yeah, it makes it more fun that way, Lance. So thanks. I have a question from Ross, and then I'll go to Tom. Why do you refer to growth of the median rather than growth of the average? Your data are all GDP PC, i.e. average output. So a technical question before we then go to Tom.
So not all of my data are GDP per capita, and GDP per capita is the average, but I precisely wanted to parse out between, so the reason I use the median is robust with respect to what happens in the right tail. So my point about poverty is just, if you take the shape of the distribution and take a measure of central tendency that's robust to changes in inequality, then that's what you get. That's why I use it. There's a tight correlation in general between GDP per capita and the median of consumption, but I think a lot of the debate has introduced measurement error into the debate by looking at the relationship between GDP per capita and poverty, when those two things are measured in very different ways. And so you're not comparing apples to apples. So the poverty data, I want to compare apples to apples. And so let's use the median of the distribution with which poverty was calculated rather than GDP per capita, because GDP per capita isn't consumption. It often is measured in radically different ways and has big gaps. So for instance, in India, there's just a huge gap between the distributional measure, the measure of consumption, and the measures of the national accounts. That's measurement error of some type. And so shouldn't have anything to do with our conceptual question of, if we move the central tendency of the distribution, do we move poverty? Yes. Do we move poverty without moving the central tendency of the distribution? No. I think that's the points Mel made with the median, and what's on the right-hand side isn't GDP per capita, it's the median. But anyway, what was the other question?
A question with a hand up to Tuan, so jump in, Tuan.
Thank you so much, Peter. Hi, Lant. I'm Tuan Nguyen, an economist from Development Policy Center. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. It's a very important issue, especially in developing countries, on whether you prioritize the growth or you prioritize the poverty reduction. As far as I understand from your presentation, you pro-growth, prioritize more investment growth. But that means that, for example, in developing countries, we need to invest in big cities, invest in the project that have a higher returns, and leave rural area and agricultural sectors, the sector that return low profit behind. Is maybe good in short term, but there's some papers, economics paper, that it may be not good in the long run for the economic growth. So that had a negative reverse effects on the growth in the long term. In the long term, how do you think about it?
What has a perverse effect on growth in the long run?
I mean, if we pro-grow too much and we don't focus on the poverty reduction, don't put enough resource on the poverty reduction.
But so first of all, let me be clearer than I've been. I regard the whole bit of poverty analysis is just wrong. It's just wrong. It's not economics. I mean, there's no economics that says, let's draw an arbitrary line through the distribution of income and consider the welfare of people just below that line as different than the people who are just above that line. So the whole strain of poverty analysis, starting with the WDR in 1990 and using low poverty lines, is just wrong. It's not good economics. It's not technically sound. So I reject the whole line of thought. And it's just led to all kinds of biases in our minds. They're just wrong. They're just wrong. They're technically wrong. And for instance, one of the main downsides of thinking we need to focus on poverty is thinking we need to focus on the poor. But there is no group called the poor. Different people are having episodes, and there's, individual volatility in households across time and space. There is no group called the poor. So by and large, right? Meaning, even if you track people who were identified as poor in one period on one set of, cross-sectional indicators, there's enormous churn above and below any given poverty line. So I think I am saying we should focus on growth, And then we should focus on a variety of social protection schemes, but those social protection schemes shouldn't necessarily be completely and totally focused on poverty. They should be focused on the shocks that people experience. They should be focused on smoothing volatility. They should be focused on a variety of things. So I think the whole line of reasoning, starting with low bar poverty lines, is wrong.
Stephen, do you want to jump in there, and then we'll go across to David's question to finish up in the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. In fact, I'm very interested also in David's question and why democracy suddenly appeared in one of your graphs, Lant. But my question was actually, you just anticipated it. Like I was thinking, like some people, you might go away from this thinking that you were against social protection programs because we should just focus on growth. So are there any policy implications of your talk?
What do you mean? I mean, yeah, you should. I don't know.
Because social protection doesn't increase growth, right? And you could come away from the talk thinking our sole objective should be to increase growth.
No, but that's not at all what I mean, right? What I mean is growth is going to make everything else possible. So what allows you to have good social protection schemes is having government revenues that you can devote to those, and making it easy and cheap to both collect revenues for social protection schemes and disperse revenues to social protection schemes. And in order to do that, you need strong state capability. You need a government that can actually carry out functions, and you need to have a robust revenue base. And if you don't have a robust revenue base, then, you know, designing anti-poverty, you know, this example of Niger, like, for God's sake, how can you imagine that some cash transfer program is going to be anything like what Niger needs when basically everybody in Niger is, you know, at any, you know, at the, you know, even at a reasonable poverty line, everybody in Niger is poor. And where Niger is, I'm all for social protection schemes, but social protection schemes protect against health shocks, for instance, or protect against income shocks, for instance. Those, you know, I have a set of papers about should we be worried about safety nets or safety ropes. What most rich, prosperous countries have, and what most of the bulk of social protection money is spent on, is not anti-poverty programs. They're insurance-like programs, like health insurance, like unemployment insurance. And only through a process of economic growth can you get adequate revenue and adequate growth and national development can you get adequate revenue. And so this is not a right-wing don't spend on social protection talk. This is a talk that if you want to be Denmark, you've got to be Denmark. You've got to have Denmark's revenue base and you've got to have Denmark's government. You can't say, oh my gosh, we can have Denmark's level of low poverty without having the national development transformation that Denmark had. And I think the idea that you know, what the kind of bias of the low bar poverty and combined with studying program design has done is taken us away from this long run historical, social, and national transformation towards individual program design. And there's no evidence at all in my mind that the aggregate indicators for most countries are heavily or even strongly influenced by overall design in an exogenous way. If you get to high income and then you get to high capability, you will get to effective programs endogenously. The exogenous variation from design, I think, no one's demonstrated to me that the exogenous variation in design is even a mildly important factor relative to what it takes to undergo these other transformations.
Great, Lant. Thank you. Sorry, we've got a couple more questions coming in, but I am just going to respect David Vanzetti's, who put his in quite a while ago, and then we'll pass over to Beth to finish up. But David asks, Lant, or he says, Lant, great talk. What's the role of democracy, which appeared in your index? How have China and Russia performed?
So it turns out that, and I've been working on this because the answer is democracy doesn't matter very much for basics. So basically, if you say, I'm just going to run a regression and I'm going to put in a measure of GDP per capita, a measure of state capability, and a measure of democracy, the democracy for basics like child health, primary education, you know, access to water and sanitation, for the basics, democracy doesn't matter at all. democracy tends to matter more for more sophisticated parts of human well-being, like tolerance and respect of civil rights and rule of law and other things. So I put democracy in there, but I have a paper that Pritchett 22 paper is called Development Matters and National Development Matters and How, and then and how question mark, and the and how question mark is precisely trying to disaggregate for which indicators is democracy important. And as you might imagine, for basics, countries like China have delivered the basics without democracy, and that doesn't seem to be much of a problem. So the correlation of basics with democracy is small, the basic poverty with democracy is small, conditional on these other things. The thing of other things, like the kinds of things that Australians worry about, is more strongly correlated with democracy. So far, that's what I can see.
Great. Well, thank you, Lant, and apologies to Premachandra and Ian, but I'm just aware of the time. So let me pass over to Beth to wrap things up. But yeah, a very big thanks, Lant. Enjoyed that discussion.
Thanks, Peter. And yes, thanks again, Lant. So this caps off a pretty fantastic Australasian Aid Conference speaker series. And it brought back some of our favourite speakers, and Lant, you're certainly one of them. I'm going to just quickly run through who we had in the past, because I don't think you all got to see them, and you can access all the presentations via the live stream replays on the Development Policy Centre website. We had Yunmi Kim on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, COVID-19 in Women, Masood Ahmed on debt challenges in developing countries, Donald Kabaruka on rethinking global health security, and Nancy Birdsall, who presented on US sins towards the developing world. So yes, please catch any of those thought-provoking and ideas-challenging seminars on the Development Policy website. It's been really great to partner with the Asia Foundation on this speaker series, and we're very excited to join them in presenting the Australasian Aid Conference, which will return in person from the 28th to the 30th of November this year. So in case we've caught you out, we have changed the permanent month for the Australasian Aid Conference to November, so not February. So please put these dates in your diary. The call for individual papers, panels, and book or report launches is open now. So please go to the website to find out all the details. The deadline's the 14th of August, so don't miss out. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all in person at the Crawford School of Public Policy in Canberra in November for the ASC 2022. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot, Lant.